He grabbed her wrist so hard she heard something crack. Not bone. Just the wooden chair she'd been clinging to, splintering under the force of her grip as she tried not to fall. Cornelius Vance, guardian, jailer, the man who had controlled every breath she took since she was 9 years old, leaned down until his face was inches from hers, and he smiled. That was the worst part. He always smiled. "You think you're going somewhere?" he whispered. "You think anyone out there wants a girl like you?" Adeline Mercer was 23 years old, and she had been asking herself that same question for 14 years. If you were sitting where she sat that night, back against the wall, dress torn at the collar, a letter hidden in your boot that represented the only exit you'd ever found, what would you have done? If this story already has your heart pounding, you're exactly who it was made for. Subscribe right now and follow Adeline's journey all the way to the end, because what happens next will change how you think about courage forever. Hit that like button, leave a comment with your city and country, and let me watch this story travel across the world. Now, let's go back to where it truly begins. The letter had taken 3 weeks to write, not because Adeline didn't know what to say, but because she'd had to write it in pieces. A sentence on a Tuesday when Cornelius left for his club, a paragraph on a Thursday morning when the housekeeper was busy in the back garden, a careful closing line one. Sunday night, by the light of a candle she'd stolen from the dining room. She had written it on paper she'd taken from his desk, using his own ink, in a house that belonged entirely to him, while belonging entirely to him. The irony of that was not lost on her. She'd seen the advertisement in a folded newspaper left on a bench outside the apothecary. She hadn't even been supposed to be outside that afternoon. Cornelius preferred she stay in. But the housekeeper, Mrs. Holt, had sent her on an errand, and for 6 unguarded minutes, Adeline had existed in the world without anyone watching her. That was when she saw it. A small column, buried between a notice for farm equipment and an announcement for a church social. Honest rancher in Colorado Territory seeks a wife of good character, hard work guaranteed, kindness also guaranteed. Write to G. Hart, Millhaven, Colorado. She'd read it 4 times standing on that sidewalk. Then she'd torn it out of the paper, quickly, hands shaking, and pressed it into the inside of her glove before walking home as if nothing had happened. As if the entire shape of what her life might become hadn't just shifted a fraction of an inch towards something other than misery. She didn't know anything about Colorado. She knew Philadelphia. She knew the 12 steps from her bedroom to the kitchen. She knew the sound Cornelius's boots made on the stairs and how many seconds she had between hearing them and being ready, because not being ready had consequences she didn't like to think about in the daylight. She knew that she was not a person in this house. She was a fixture, something to be managed. The letter she finally sent was careful. She told G. Hart that she was 23, that she could cook and sew and manage a household, that she was in good health and of sound mind. She did not mention that her left shoulder had been dislocated twice and had never quite healed right. She did not mention the things she'd learned to do with her breathing whenever someone raised their voice. A slow pull through the nose, hold, release through the mouth. A trick she'd developed when she was maybe 11 or 12, when she'd figured out that panic made everything worse. She did not mention any of that. She mentioned that she was eager for hard work and a fresh start, and she meant both of those things with every fractured piece of herself. His reply came in 11 days. It was short. Not cold, just short, the way a man writes when he thinks more than he talks. He said he had read her letter twice and found it honest. He said the ranch was no place for a woman looking for comfort, but that he'd never once been called cruel. He said if she was serious, he would send train fare, and the choice was entirely hers. The choice is entirely yours. She had to set the letter down and stand at the window for a full minute because her eyes had gone blurry, and she absolutely would not, let herself cry in this house over something good. Good things in Cornelius's house had a way of getting taken. She wrote back the same afternoon. Yes. Getting out required the kind of planning that would have impressed a military general, which Adeline thought about sometimes with a dark, private humor that was the only kind she'd been permitted to develop. She couldn't take much. A carpet bag packed in layers over the course of a week. A dress one day, her mother's cameo brooch the next, a spare pair of stockings the day after. Small things. Things that wouldn't be noticed missing one at a time. She chose a Thursday. Cornelius had his card game Thursday evenings, and he never came home before midnight. Mrs. Holt retired early. She walked out the front door at 7:30, carpetbag in hand, wearing her second-best dress because her best one would have looked like she was going somewhere important and she couldn't afford to look like she was going anywhere at all. She walked 4 blocks before she let herself breathe properly. She walked 8 blocks before she stopped checking over her shoulder. She made it to the station with an hour to spare, bought her ticket with the money Gideon Hart had sent, and sat in the very corner of the women's waiting room with her bag on her lap and her hands folded on top of it. She sat like that for the entire hour. When the train finally lurched forward and the lights of Philadelphia began sliding past the window and then falling behind her one by one, Adeline Mercer did not feel relief. She didn't feel joy. She didn't feel the clean, bright liberation she'd imagined in all those months of imagining. She felt something much smaller and much more complicated, a loosening, like a fist unclenching after holding on so long the fingers had forgotten how to straighten. It hurt. The loosening hurt. She hadn't expected that. She sat in that rattling train car for 3 days and watched the country change around her until it became something she had no name for. Wide and brown and enormous. Bigger than any idea of space she'd grown up with. The sky alone taking up more room than all of Philadelphia. It made her feel small, and strangely, that was all right. In Philadelphia, being small had been dangerous. Out here, looking out at those impossible plains, she got the first thin sense that maybe small and invisible were not the same thing. Millhaven Station was barely a station. A platform, a roof held up by 2 posts, a man behind a small window who looked as though he'd rather be somewhere warmer. Adeline stepped off the train and the October wind hit her like a flat hand, cutting right through her wool coat, and she had to grab the brim of her hat before it went sideways. She stood there on the platform with her carpet bag and her hat and her carefully arranged expression, and she looked for a man she'd never seen. There were maybe a dozen people milling around. Her eyes moved over them quickly. The practiced automatic scan she'd done her whole life in any room, cataloging exits and moods and the particular posture of someone about to cause a problem. Old habit. Maybe a habit she'd have for the rest of her life, she thought. She almost missed him because he wasn't watching her the way she expected. Most of the men who glanced toward the arriving passengers did what men did. They looked, they assessed, some of them stared in the openly unconcerned way of men who'd never been told not to. The man standing at the far end of the platform was doing none of that. He was looking at the ground, hat in his hands, turning it by the brim in a slow circle, the way someone does when they're nervous but don't have anywhere to put the nerves. He was tall, wide through the shoulders, hands that were visibly rough even from 20 feet away. His coat was clean but old, mended at one elbow with thread that didn't quite match. When he finally looked up, his eyes found her directly, and he didn't look away, but he also didn't move toward her immediately. He just looked. And then he nodded, once, the smallest acknowledgement, as if to say, "I see you, no rush." She crossed the distance between them herself. "Mr. Hart," she said. "Miss Mercer." His voice was lower than she'd expected. He put his hat back on. "Did you eat? On the train, I mean. They sometimes don't." "I had something," she said. "Good." He picked up her carpet bag before she could reach for it, not snatching it, just moving to take it in the easy way of someone who'd decided to carry a thing and was going to carry it. She felt her hand tighten involuntarily on the handle for half a second before she let go. He didn't comment on it. That was the first thing she noticed. The wagon ride to the ranch took nearly 2 hours, and Adeline spent most of it watching the land and the space between words. Gideon Hart was not a man who talked to fill silence. He offered facts when they seemed useful. That's the Caldwell farm over there. Best to avoid their bull if it gets out. Road gets rough after the creek crossing. Hold on to the seat there. And otherwise seemed content to let the quiet exist between them without apology. She'd been braced for questions. Men like Cornelius always had questions. Where were you? What were you doing? Who did you speak to? Why does your face look like that? Questions that weren't really questions. She'd rehearsed answers on the train, partial truths and careful deflections. The architecture of a past that revealed as little as possible. Gideon Hart didn't ask her anything. Once, about halfway through the ride, the wagon hit a rut and lurched, and without thinking, without any calculation at all, she grabbed his arm, just for a second. Her hand on his sleeve, then immediately withdrawn, her face going carefully neutral. Sorry, she said. Don't be, he said. Just that. His eyes stayed on the road. She pressed her hands together in her lap and stared at the passing scrubland and tried to figure out what kind of man didn't make something out of nothing. In her experience, they were rare enough to be treated with suspicion. Kindness that asked for nothing was a thing she didn't entirely trust yet. She understood that about herself. She wasn't proud of it, but she understood it. When the ranch finally came into view, the low house, the barn, the fence lines running out toward the horizon, she noted practically what it was. Modest. Solid. Nothing showy. The kind of place built to last rather than to impress. It's not much to look at, Gideon said, and there was no apology in it, just honesty. It's fine, she said. And she meant that too, though perhaps not for the reasons he assumed. The first real moment came that evening. She'd been washing up before supper, a small tin basin in the kitchen, water from the pump still cold from the ground, and she'd pushed her sleeves up without thinking. The kitchen was warm from the stove and she was focused on her hands and she simply forgot, for one unguarded moment, where she was and who might be in the room. Gideon had come in from the barn. She heard him stop. She looked up and found him standing just inside the doorway, hat in his hand again, and his eyes were on her forearms. Not in a prying way. Not even in the way of a man trying to work something out. His face had gone very still, the way a face goes when a person is absorbing something they weren't prepared for and is trying very hard not to react in a way that makes it worse. The bruises were old but not gone. Yellow-green at the edges, one of them fading into a kind of sick brown near her wrist. Her right forearm had a ridge along it, thin and white, from something years before that had healed crooked. She pulled her sleeves down. He didn't say anything immediately. He moved to the basin on the far side of the room and began washing his own hands, and the silence stretched between them, different now, waited. Then he said quietly, without looking up from the water, "Who hurt you?" 3 words. No accusation in them, no demand, just a question asked in the voice of a man who already knew the answer was going to be something terrible and was asking anyway because he thought she deserved to be asked. Adeline stood very still. Her first instinct was denial. She'd been denying for so long the reflex was faster than thought. I fell, I'm clumsy, it's nothing, I'm fine. The words were right there, ready to go, worn smooth from years of use. But she looked at him. This man she'd known for less than a day, this stranger she'd agreed to marry, standing with his back half turned to give her room, not pressing, not watching her face for the lie. And something in her chest did something she couldn't name. "My guardian," she said. "In Philadelphia." He nodded, slow, said nothing. "He won't," she started, and then she stopped because she had been about to say, "He won't find me," and she wasn't sure yet if that was true. She settled for, "I left." "I know," Gideon said. "You're here." He dried his hands on the cloth by the basin and turned around, and his face was not horrified, not pitying, not calculating in the way she'd feared most. He looked tired, maybe. And something else. Something she didn't have a word for yet, something that sat between anger and sorrow and was entirely directed away from her. "Supper's on the stove," he said. "You don't have to explain anything tonight, or tomorrow, or ever, if you decide that's what you want." She stood there after he walked past her into the next room, her sleeves back down, her hands still damp, and she thought, he didn't make me small. She thought, I don't know what to do with that. She stood there for long enough that the pot on the stove began to rattle, and then she picked up the ladle and stirred it, and she made herself breathe. In through the nose, hold, out slow. And she thought that whatever came next, she had at least made it to the next thing. That was more than she'd managed for years. Outside, the Colorado wind came off the plains and pressed against the walls of the small house, testing it, finding it solid. Inside, a woman who had run as far as she could stood in a stranger's kitchen and stirred a pot of stew and tried, slowly, painfully, without any certainty of success, to remember that she was still a person. She hadn't forgotten entirely, but it had been close. She didn't sleep well that first night, or the second. The bed was fine, a real bed, a good mattress, nothing like the narrow cot she'd had in Philadelphia. But fine beds don't fix the kind of sleeplessness that lives inside the body rather than in the springs. She lay in the dark of the small room Gideon had given her, listening to sounds she didn't recognize yet. Wind against the roof, something in the barn shifting its weight, the particular creak of the house cooling down after dark, wood contracting in the cold, which she kept hearing as footsteps coming down a hall. Every time she heard that creak, her whole body went rigid. By the third morning, she was tired in a way that had nothing to do with how many hours she'd been horizontal, and she came into the kitchen with the specific flat look of someone who has spent the night fighting themselves and lost. Gideon was already at the table with coffee. He glanced at her once, then looked back at his cup. "Wood settles at night," he said, as if continuing a conversation they hadn't started. "This house especially. Old timber. Makes noise." She stopped in the middle of reaching for the coffee pot. "It's not footsteps," he added, in case that's what it sounds like. She poured her coffee and sat down across from him and didn't say anything for a long moment. Then, "How did you know?" "Because I didn't sleep for 6 weeks after I first moved out here either," he said. "Different reason, but same problem. Too quiet, then something makes a sound, and your whole chest locks up." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "It passes." It was possibly the most words he'd strung together since she'd arrived. She looked at him over the rim of her cup and thought, there's something behind that, something he didn't explain, and she didn't ask, because he hadn't asked her either, and that felt like a kind of agreement between them, even if neither had said so out loud. "What time do you need me up?" she asked. "Whenever you're up," he said. That's not an answer. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to his face, but it was close. 4:30, usually, but there's no rule. She was up at 4:15 the next morning. She had no idea what she was doing, but she was up. The ranch had its own logic, and it took her time to learn it, the way you learn a language, badly at first, then in pieces. Then one morning you realize you've understood something without translating it first. Gideon didn't explain things twice. Not because he was impatient, but because he said things plainly the first time and expected her to have heard him, which was, she realized slowly, a form of respect she wasn't accustomed to receiving. The fire was the first thing. She'd grown up cooking on a proper iron stove with a reliable damper, and she understood the basic principle of fire, fuel, air, heat. But the open cooking fire out here was different. It had moods. It responded to wind and moisture in the air and the particular dryness of the wood and about a dozen other variables she couldn't name yet. And the first morning she tried to manage it herself. It burned too hot, and she scorched the bottom of the cornbread and stood there staring at it with her jaw tight and her eyes burning from the smoke and something that was not quite anger and not quite humiliation coiling in her chest. Gideon came in, looked at the pan, looked at her face, and said, "Cornbread's better with a darker bottom anyway." "It's burned," she said flatly. "Bit," he agreed. "Fire was too high. You want to get the coals to this stage?" He crouched down and showed her, pointing to the particular color and behavior of the embers without taking the tongs from her hand. "And then it'll hold even without watching it every second." She did it his way the next morning. It worked. She didn't thank him exactly. She just set the cornbread on the table and sat down, and he ate 2 pieces without comment, and that felt like the exchange was complete. But there were things harder than cornbread. There were the chickens, which she had to learn to handle without flinching from the sudden chaos of wings when she reached for the eggs, because flinching scattered them, and then you had a real problem. There was the matter of the water pump, which required a specific technique. Prime it with a cup of water first, then pump in a steady rhythm, not too fast, and which she got wrong 3 mornings in a row until her arms ached and she was cold through, and she finally got it right, and the water came up in a solid rush, and she nearly laughed, would have laughed, except laughing freely at small victories was something she was still practicing. There was the neighbor woman, Ruth Calloway, who came by the second week with a pie and a bright assessing look that she made no effort to hide. Ruth was somewhere in her late 40s, built solid, with the kind of face that had spent 20 years outdoors and looked better for it. She sets the pie on the table and shook Adeline's hand with a grip that meant business and said, "So you're the one Gideon sent east for?" "I'm Adeline," Adeline said. "I know who you are, honey. I'm Ruth. That pie's apple because I didn't know what you liked. An apple is harder to dislike than most things." She sat down without being invited, which Adeline would have found presumptuous anywhere else, but somehow didn't hear. "He treating you all right?" "Yes," Adeline said, and it was true, and saying it still felt slightly strange because true and yes hadn't always been the same answer. Ruth looked at her for a moment with the particular focus of a woman who had spent her life reading people and wasn't fooled easily, Then she said, "You look tired." "I'm adjusting," Adeline said. "That's a polite way to put it." Ruth folded her hands on the table. "This land takes some getting used to. It took me 2 years before I stopped waking up thinking I was somewhere else. Don't let anyone rush you." Adeline thought of Gideon saying it passes. She thought of the way both of them said things simply and then left room for the words to sit. "What made you stay?" she asked Ruth. Ruth tilted her head. "What do you mean?" "Out here. The work is hard. The winters, from what I understand. What made you decide it was worth staying?" Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then, "My husband's a good man, and I built something here that's mine. Those two things together." She shrugged one shoulder. "Some people need more than that. I didn't." Adeline cut 2 slices of pie and they ate it at the table, and Ruth talked about the neighboring families and the names Adeline should know and the ones she should probably avoid, and all of it was practical and useful and delivered without condescension. And when Ruth left, she squeezed Adeline's hand at the door and said, "You need anything? You send word. Women out here look out for each other. That's not optional." Adeline stood in the doorway after Ruth's wagon had gone and felt something she recognized after a moment as the cautious beginning of something like being welcome somewhere. She didn't lean into it. It was too new and too fragile, and she knew better than to trust things that were too new. But she didn't push it away either. The marriage itself was a quiet affair in front of the justice of the peace in town, a week after she arrived. Gideon wore his good coat. She wore her best dress, the one she hadn't worn on the train because she hadn't wanted to look like she was going somewhere important. She was going somewhere important now, though she was still working out what that meant. The justice of the peace was a small man named Aldridge, who seemed to be running on coffee and habit, and he read through the words with the efficiency of someone who had done this enough times that the ceremony was procedural but not unkind. Gideon said "I do" in his flat, even voice, and meant it in whatever way he'd decided he meant it. She said "I do," and her voice stayed steady, which she'd been quietly practicing in the mornings, and she was proud of that in a private, unshowy way. Afterward, he bought her a piece of pie at the small restaurant on the main street because the apple pie from Ruth had apparently given him the idea, and they sat across from each other and ate it, and she said, "Are we supposed to feel different now?" And he said, "I don't know. Do you?" And she said, "Not yet." And he said, "Me neither." And somehow that was fine. What she noticed, though, what she noted in that careful cataloging way she had, was that he walked back to the wagon on her left side. Not crowding her, not right behind her, just there, between her and the street where the traffic was, where a person might come from. It was the side a man walks on when he's thinking about what might startle someone. She didn't know if he'd done it consciously. She almost asked. Then she decided she didn't want to know, because either answer would have complicated something that was working the way it was. The first real test of her came in November. Gideon needed to take a small herd to the rail junction 40 miles east, which meant 3 days, possibly 4, and Adeline alone on the ranch with the animals and the weather and whatever else came. He told her a week in advance, which she appreciated. He told her where everything was: the rifle and the ammunition, the extra feed, the weak spots in the south fence that needed watching. He told her Ruth Calloway was 20 minutes by horse if she needed anything, and had already been told he'd be gone. "You don't have to stay," he said the evening before he left. "You could go to Ruth's," she offered. "I'm fine here," Adeline said. He looked at her. "It's not a test," he said. "I'm not checking to see what you'll do." "I know," she said. "I want to stay." What she didn't say was that staying felt important to her in a way that had nothing to do with proving herself to him. It had to do with proving something to herself, that she could be in a place alone and not be afraid of the place itself, only of the things she'd brought with her, and that those things were hers to manage. He left before dawn. She heard the horses, and then she heard nothing. The first day was hard in a concrete way. The work was simply more than she'd expected. The livestock took longer without a second pair of hands, and by mid-afternoon her back was a solid line of pain, and she'd torn her palm on a fence wire and wrapped it in a strip of cloth from her apron. She sat on the porch step that evening with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand and watched the dark come in from the west, and told herself she was fine. She was fine. She'd had harder days than this. The second night was when the trouble found her. She was inside, nearly asleep, when she heard something at the south fence. Not the house settling. An animal sound, wrong and irregular, and then a separate sound, heavier, deliberate. She was out of bed before she'd made a conscious decision about it, pulling on her boots, reaching for the rifle, moving through the dark house by feel because she'd made herself learn where everything was in the dark. She came out the back to find that one of the young steers had tangled itself in the damaged section of south fence and was in a panic, wrenching against the wire, and the wire was cutting into its leg with every movement and making it worse. She could see the dark line of blood on its hide. She could see the fence straining, sections of post pulling loose. Her hands were shaking, not from cold. She'd never handled livestock in a crisis. She'd barely been around livestock 3 months ago. But she'd watched Gideon, the way he moved around scared animals. Slow, no sudden motion, voice down low. And she went toward the steer the way he'd go toward a scared animal, one slow step at a time, talking low even though what she was saying made no particular sense. Easy. Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you. Just stay still. Just stop fighting it. You're making it worse. The steer did not stop fighting it, because it was an animal in pain and terror, but her approach slowed it marginally, and that was enough. She got her hands on the wire with her torn palm screaming at her and worked it loose section by section, twice getting it backwards and having to start again, once getting the wire across her wrist in a way that would leave a mark, until finally the steer lurched free and stood there shaking. And she stood there shaking too, both of them in the dark, breathing hard. She checked the leg as best she could in the dark. Deep scrape, bleeding, but not severed, not broken. She got the animal to the barn and cleaned the wound with what she had, and stayed with it long enough that it stopped trembling. She didn't go back inside until past midnight. She sat at the kitchen table for a while with her hands wrapped, and her mind doing that particular thing it did when the adrenaline was draining, going over every step, checking where she'd been wrong, where she'd been slow, where she could have done better. The old version of this habit had been punishing. Cornelius had trained her to find her own failures before he had to point them out. But sitting there in the cold kitchen, she realized she wasn't looking for failures. She was just reviewing. The way you review a thing you did so you know how to do it better next time. That was different. She sat with that difference for a while. When Gideon came back on the 4th day, he found the ranch in order and Adeline with a bandaged hand and a section of south fence she'd repaired herself using lumber from the barn and everything she remembered watching him do. Her repair was not elegant. The posts were slightly uneven and she'd used more wire than she'd needed to in a couple of places. But it was solid. She'd tested it herself. He walked the repaired section and came back and looked at her hand. Steer got caught in it, she said. Night of the 2nd day. I got him out. He's fine. Gideon looked at the fence again, then at her. You did this yourself. There wasn't anyone else to do it, she said. He was quiet for a moment. You could have left it. It would have come down before you got back. He nodded slowly. You're right. He looked at her hand again. Does it need attention? It's clean. I cleaned it. All right, he said, and then, that's a good fence, Adeline. She'd been waiting, without fully knowing she was waiting, for him to find something wrong with it. 3 months ago, she'd have been braced for a list. Wrong amount of wire, wrong spacing, wrong angle on the posts. What were you thinking? Why didn't you wait? Why did you? He said that's good fence, and walked past her towards the barn to see to his horse, and she stood in the yard and thought, I did a hard thing, and it was enough. Just that. Nothing more complicated. It was enough. December came, and with it, the cold that people here talked about with the particular shorthand of people who'd survived a thing more than once. Bad winter coming? You can feel it. She heard it from Ruth, from the man at the dry goods store, from the ranchers who passed by on the road and lifted their chins at Gideon and said it like a greeting. She started paying attention to what the cold meant in practical terms. It meant the water pump needed to be worked before the temperature dropped in the late afternoon, or it would freeze and you'd have a problem. It meant livestock needed extra feed, and the barn door needed to seal properly, and she spent an afternoon in November with a bag of hay stuffed into the gaps around the frame before Gideon got home and saw what she was doing and handed her a proper strip of oiled leather without a word and showed her how to tack it in place so it would stay all winter. She started doing that, watching for the practical problem before it became a crisis. It was the same instinct she'd had her whole life, the constant reading of a room, the constant anticipation. only now she was pointing it at weather and livestock and fences instead of a man's mood. The instinct itself was the same. The target was different. It made her useful. It made her fast. And for the first time in her life, being fast and anticipating trouble was something that worked in her favor rather than just something she did to survive. Ruth noticed. Ruth noticed everything. "You learn quick," Ruth said one afternoon in December, when she'd stopped by and found Adeline in the middle of rigging a windbreak for the chicken coop with lumber and old burlap feed sacks. "I have good reason to," Adeline said. "Most of the women who come out here, the mail-order ones, I mean, no offense to you, none taken. Most of them fold in about 6 weeks, not because they're weak, because they didn't understand what they were coming to." Ruth looked at the windbreak. "You understood." Adeline tied off the last knot and stood back and looked at it. "I understood that anything was better than where I was coming from," she said, and it was the most she'd said to anyone out here about Philadelphia, and she felt Ruth go still beside her, very careful, not pressing. "Well," Ruth said finally, "whatever it was, it taught you how to work, and out here that counts for more than most things." They stood in the cold and looked at the chicken coop, and neither of them said anything else, and it was all right. She and Gideon had a fight in January, the first real one. It was about something small. It always started with something small, which was the question of whether she should be riding out alone to check the east pasture or whether she should wait for him. He'd said casually, over breakfast, that he'd checked the east pasture that afternoon, and she'd said she'd already done it that morning, and he'd looked up from his plate and said, "I didn't ask you to do that." "I know," she said. "I did it anyway." "Adeline, that's—" He put his fork down. "That's a long ride. If something happened—" "Nothing happened," she said. "But if it had, you were out there alone and I didn't know where you were." "I know how to ride," she said, and her voice had gone flat in a way she recognized as a warning to herself as much as to him. "I've been riding for 2 months. I know that land." "I'm not saying you don't—" "Then what are you saying?" She looked at him directly, not flinching, not looking away. "That I need permission?" The word landed between them and she felt him feel it. He picked his fork back up and then set it back down and said very carefully, "I'm saying I'd like to know where you are. That's not the same thing." She sat with that. The distinction was real and she knew it was real, and it irritated her that she'd conflated the two because she prided herself on being precise. Only her precision had been so long trained in one direction. Watch for control, watch for restriction, watch for the shape of a cage, that she'd read his concern as something else. "I'll tell you when I'm going somewhere," she said, eventually. "That's reasonable." "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me like I'm doing you a favor," she said. "It's a practical arrangement." "All right," he said. They finished breakfast. The argument was over, but the feeling of it stayed in the room most of the morning, and she went about her work with the particular tight focus of someone using activity to process feeling, and at some point in the afternoon she realized she wasn't angry at him. She was angry at the reflex, the one that heard "where were you" and heard threat, the one that was always listening for the thing underneath the thing. She was angry that it was still there, still fast, still the first translation she reached for. She didn't know how to fix that. She wasn't sure it could be fixed, exactly. She thought maybe it was more like the shoulder, the one that had been dislocated twice, that had never quite healed straight, that ached before rain. You didn't fix it. You learned its limits. You learned to work around it, and on good days you forgot it was there. At supper he passed her the bread without being asked because he'd noticed she always took bread, and she'd been sitting on the wrong side of the table from where it was. And he didn't make anything of it, just slid it across, and she took it. And they ate in the easy quiet they'd been building for 3 months. And she thought, he is trying to learn the shape of me. And she was trying to learn the shape of him. And they were both doing it slowly, without any guarantee of getting it right, and that was the best either of them could offer. It was, she thought, more honest than anything she'd known before. Outside, the January wind came off the mountains in a long, low moan that pressed against the windows and tested the hay-stuffed gaps and the oiled leather strips and found them solid. The fire in the stove ticked and settled. Gideon refilled her coffee cup without asking, because she'd been nursing the cold last inch and he'd noticed, and she wrapped her hands around the warm mug and felt the ache in her torn palm, healing now, nearly healed, and thought about the fence, about the steer, about the windbreak and the pump, and the east pasture in the January cold, the frozen grass crackling under the horses' hooves, the sky so wide and white it made you feel like you were looking at the beginning of something. She was still afraid sometimes. She woke up some nights with her heart slamming and her hands already in fists before she'd opened her eyes. She still flinched at raised voices and read every room she walked into. Out of instinct, she couldn't turn off. She still had days where the weight of what she'd carried so long made it hard to move through simple tasks. Where the grief of it, and it was grief, she'd started to understand that. The grief of years you didn't get to live differently, sat on her chest like a stone. But she was also, in ways she hadn't predicted and couldn't have planned for, becoming something else alongside the fear. Something that could hold a rifle in the dark and talk a panicked animal down. Something that could fix a fence wrong and fix it again until it held. Something that could sit across a table from a man she hadn't known 3 months ago and argue with him and be wrong and admit it. She was becoming someone who took up space without asking permission for it. That was new. That was very new. And some mornings she woke up before the alarm of habit, in the dark of the good room in the solid house on the edge of the Colorado plains, and she lay there in the quiet and thought, I am still here. I made it to the next thing. That was enough. For now, that was enough. The storm didn't announce itself the way storms were supposed to. There was no dramatic buildup, no sky turning that particular greenish yellow that people in the territory described as the warning color. It came in from the northwest in the early morning hours of the 3rd week of February, moving fast and low, and by the time the temperature had dropped 15 degrees in the space of 2 hours, Gideon was already 12 miles from home. He'd left before dawn for the high pasture roundup, a 2-day gather of the cattle that had drifted toward the mountain foothills over the winter, necessary before the spring movement, the kind of work that couldn't be put off because the window for it was narrow and the consequences of waiting were worse than the discomfort of going. He told her 2 days, maybe 3. He told her what to watch for in the sky. He told her if the temperature dropped fast, get the livestock in and stay inside. What he hadn't told her, because neither of them had known to say it, was what she should do if the temperature dropped fast, and he wasn't back, and the sky went the color of a bruise, and the wind started carrying ice in it before noon. She knew what she was supposed to do. Ruth had told her, plainly, back in December when they'd talked about bad winters. You stay put. You don't go looking for anyone. The land will swallow you, and then there's 2 problems instead of 1. The logic was sound. The logic was exactly right. She knew that. She got the livestock in by 10 in the morning, working fast, the cold already finding the gaps between her coat collar and her scarf, her breath coming in hard white puffs. She got the barn door secured with the extra latch Gideon had installed in November. She banked the fire in the house and brought in enough wood to last 2 days, and then brought in more on top of that. She did everything right, everything a sensible person would do. Then she stood at the window and watched the sky and did the arithmetic she'd been doing since she'd started worrying, which was approximately when she'd woken up at 3 in the morning with a feeling she couldn't name. 12 miles. High pasture, which meant elevation, which meant the storm would hit there harder and earlier than it was hitting here. He had Tom Briggs with him, one of the 2 hands who helped with the seasonal work. But Tom Briggs was 43 years old and had a bad knee that made him slow on foot, which mattered if a horse went down. The cattle would scatter in this wind. You could lose 1/3 of a herd in a bad storm if they panicked and ran for the ravines. And Gideon, careful, competent, unhurried Gideon, who read this land the way she'd learned to read a room, could still make a wrong call in weather he hadn't seen coming fast enough. Nobody was right every time. She knew that. She knew it because he'd told her so himself one evening in January, talking about a storm 2 years back that had cost him 11 head and 1 very good horse and a section of fence that had taken him all of April to rebuild. I waited too long to move them, he'd said. I was wrong about the timing. It happens. It happens. She stood at the window for 20 minutes. The snow was coming sideways now, the wind making a sound in the eaves that she'd started to recognize over the winter, but had never heard quite this loud. She thought about Ruth's voice saying, "The land will swallow you." She thought about the rifle over the door and the extra blankets in the chest. She thought about Gideon's face, very still, absorbing something he hadn't expected, the night he'd seen her arms. She went to the barn and saddled the gray mare. Her hands weren't steady. She noticed that without judgment, the way she'd learned to notice things about herself without making them into verdicts. The hands were going to shake. That was information. She cinched the saddle anyway. She took the rifle. She took rope. Because rope was what you needed when you didn't know what you'd need. She took the 2 extra blankets from the chest and rolled them behind the saddle. She left a note on the kitchen table, gone to find Gideon, high pasture, northeast trail. Because if something happened to her as well, Ruth needed to know where to look. She wrote Ruth's name at the top of the note so it was clear who it was for, and she weighted it with the coffee pot so it wouldn't blow off if the door opened. Then she went out into the storm. The first mile was manageable. The trail northeast was one she'd ridden a dozen times by now, and the mare knew it, and the snow was heavy but not yet blinding. She kept her head down and let the mare find her footing and concentrated on the landmarks she'd memorized. The split rock formation at the creek, the dead cottonwood that leaned east, the place where the trail forked and you took the left branch for the high pasture. The second mile was harder. The wind had found a direction it liked, and it was driving the snow horizontally, which meant it was getting into every gap in her clothing, and the mare was having to work against it rather than through it. Adeline kept talking to her, low and steady, the same way she'd talked to the steer that night in November, which had worked well enough then and was probably useless now, but felt better than silence. By the third mile, she couldn't see more than 20 feet ahead. This was the point, she knew, where a sensible person turned back. The trail was obscured. The visibility was nearly nothing. The temperature was still dropping. She could feel it in the way her face hurt, the skin on her cheekbones going from pain to something that felt less like pain and more like absence, which was worse. The mare was nervous, ears flat, moving with the careful stiffness of an animal that wanted very much to go the other direction. "I know," she told the mare. "Keep going." She had a memory, sudden and sharp, of being 14 years old and standing at the top of the stairs in Cornelius's house, listening to him come through the front door below, listening to the particular sound of his footsteps that told her what kind of evening it was going to be, and making herself walk down those stairs anyway. Not because she wasn't afraid, because she'd calculated that the consequences of not coming down were worse than the consequences of going down. That had been the whole calculus of her life for years. Not am I afraid, but what happens if I don't move? She was doing the same arithmetic now and getting the same answer. She kept going. The trail climbed. The wind got louder. She passed the dead cottonwood and took the left branch and climbed another half-mile before the mare suddenly stopped and wouldn't move. And Adeline looked up from her hunched position against the wind and saw, through the curtain of blowing snow, the dark shapes of cattle. Not moving. Bunched together at the edge of what she recognized, with a drop of cold dread, as the ravine, the East Ravine, which in clear weather was a manageable feature of the landscape, and in a blizzard with panicked cattle pressing toward it was a death trap. She counted the shapes she could see. 15, maybe 20 head. Cattle in a storm crowd into each other, and the ones on the outside push toward the ones in the middle, and the whole mass drifts, and sometimes drifts right over an edge before anyone can stop it. She scanned the snow and the shapes and couldn't find a man, couldn't find a horse. The cattle were bunched and still, and the ravine edge was maybe 40 feet behind them, and there was no one there. "Gideon!" The wind took it. She tried again, louder. "Gideon!" Nothing. She dismounted because you couldn't work cattle from a horse that didn't want to be there, and she looped the mare's reins around her wrist and started toward the herd on foot, talking, moving slow, trying to create the kind of calm pressure that would shift them away from the ravine rather than into it. She'd watched Gideon work cattle for 5 months. She knew the theory. The practice, in a blizzard, alone, with numb hands and a horse pulling against her wrist, was a different matter. The closest steer turned its head toward her. She kept moving, slow arc to the left, talking low. "Easy, easy. Move up. Go on." She waved her free arm and the front animals began to shift, grudgingly, reluctantly, the way cattle move when they've decided they might, and the mass of them started to drift left, away from the ravine, which was all she needed. She'd been pushing them for maybe 10 minutes, enough to get the bulk of the herd 20 feet from the edge, when she nearly walked into him. Gideon was on the ground. He was on his side behind a boulder that had been blocking him from her view. Deliberately, she realized, he'd gotten himself to the boulder for shelter from the wind, with his back against the rock and his coat pulled around him and his eyes open. He looked up at her with the slightly unfocused look of someone who has been cold and alone long enough that the appearance of another person doesn't fully register immediately. "Adeline," he said, and his voice was wrong, thick, slow. "Where are you hurt?" She was already crouching, hands moving to check, cold fingers finding his coat and working to see underneath. Leg, he said. Horse went down at the creek crossing. Leg got caught. He shifted and she heard his breath pull in sharp. I don't think it's broken. Might be. Can you stand? Haven't tried. We need to try, she said. We need to get you on my horse, right now. The cattle are away from the ravine, she said. I moved them. We need to go. He looked at her for a moment with that unfocused look, and then something in his face sharpened. She could see him pulling himself back together by effort, the way a person does when someone else needs them to function. All right, he said. Getting him up was hard. His leg, it was the left one, the knee and upper shin, took his weight badly, and he made a sound when he first tried to stand that she filed away and didn't react to, because reacting would slow them down and they needed to move. She got herself under his left arm, and he put his weight on her, and they took 3 steps before he said tightly, I need a second. You've got 5, she said. Then we move. He almost laughed. Yes, ma'am, he said, which was the first time he'd ever said it, and she felt it land somewhere under her ribs but didn't have time for it now. The mare was not cooperative about taking his weight. She sidestepped, nervous, unhappy, and Adeline held the reins close and talked to her in the same relentless low voice, and eventually the mare decided to tolerate this, which was the best outcome available. Getting Gideon into the saddle with a bad leg and a horse that wanted to be somewhere warmer was the hardest physical thing she had done since arriving in Colorado, and she did it by not thinking about whether it was possible and just doing the next step and then the next one until he was up. She tied the blankets around him. Her fingers were bad by this point, clumsy and unreliable, and she had to look at what they were doing because she couldn't feel it properly. She got the knots done. She took the reins and started leading the mare back down the trail on foot. You're going to freeze, Gideon said from above her. I'll move faster than you will, she said. That helps? Adeline, don't argue with me right now, she said. I'll argue back and we'll both freeze. Save it. He was quiet after that. She walked and he rode, and the wind was a wall they moved through rather than in, and she fixed her eyes on the trail ahead and thought about nothing except the next step. The split rock, the dead cottonwood leaning east, the left fork. She counted landmarks because counting was something to do with her mind that wasn't being afraid. Somewhere around the 4th mile, she stopped being cold in the way that hurt and started being cold in a way that was almost peaceful, which she knew was the bad kind, and walked faster because of it. Tom Briggs found them a mile from the house. He came out of the snow on horseback looking like something assembled from weather and desperation. And when he saw them, his whole face collapsed with relief before he got it back under control. He'd been with the smaller group of cattle a ridge over and had circled back when the storm broke bad, and found the horse down and Gideon gone, and had been making himself ride a search pattern ever since. Take the reins, Adeline said, and her voice came out rougher than she expected. Get him home. What about? I'm right behind you, she said. Go. She was not right behind them. She was slower than she'd been, her legs not quite cooperating the way legs should, and she covered the last mile in a stumbling walk that had nothing graceful about it. When the house finally came through the snow, she stopped for a moment and stood there and felt something shake loose in her chest. Not relief. Relief was too clean a word for it. More like a knot coming undone, painful the way things are painful when they've been held too tight for too long. She went inside. Tom had gotten Gideon onto the kitchen chair. He was still in his coat, the blankets partly unwound, and Tom was trying to get his boot off the bad leg, which was producing a reaction from Gideon that suggested the leg was in fact quite unhappy with everything. Ruth was there. Ruth, who had apparently seen the storm coming and come over because Ruth Calloway had a particular relationship with disasters that amounted to appearing before she was called. And Ruth looked up when Adeline came through the door, and her face did something complicated. Sit down, Ruth said. The leg, Adeline said. I'm looking at the leg. Sit down, Adeline, right now. She sat because her legs had more or less made that decision for her anyway. Ruth pressed a mug of something hot into her hands. Coffee, heavily laced with something from the flask she kept in her coat pocket and never discussed. And then went back to Gideon, and Adeline sat at her own kitchen table and held the mug and watched. Gideon's leg was not broken. Ruth declared this after a thorough examination that Gideon bore with a stillness that was clearly costing him something, though he didn't make much noise. Badly bruised, possibly a torn muscle below the knee, One cut on the shin that needed cleaning and wrapping. Nothing that wouldn't heal. Ruth said it like a verdict, and Adeline felt the last clenched thing in her chest let go. "You went after him," Tom said. He was standing by the stove, warming his hands, looking at her with an expression she didn't quite know how to read. "Yes," she said. "In that," he said, meaning the storm, still audible outside, the wind having declined to acknowledge that the crisis was over. "He was out there," she said, because to her that was the whole explanation. Tom looked at Gideon, and then at her, and then at the floor, and didn't say anything else. Ruth, finishing the wrapping on Gideon's leg with competent efficiency, said, "Tom, go check the livestock and then go home. I'll stay tonight." Tom went without argument. The kitchen settled into a different kind of quiet. Still tense, but the particular tension of crisis that's been survived rather than crisis still unfolding. Ruth made food. She did it without asking whether anyone wanted food because Ruth understood that people who'd been out in blizzards needed to eat, whether they felt like it or not. Adeline sat at the table and drank her laced coffee and felt the warmth come back into her hands in the tingling, painful way that meant they were going to be all right. Across the table, Gideon looked at her. He'd been looking at her on and off since she'd walked in, with the slightly stunned quality of someone working through what they'd been told happened while they were leaning against a boulder trying to stay conscious. The cattle moved from the ravine. The note on the table. The mare's hoofprints leading northeast into the blizzard. "You came out in that," he said. Not a question. "Yes," she said. "I told you if the temperature dropped." "I know what you told me," she said. "You could have—" He stopped. She watched him close his eyes for a second and open them again. "You could have died out there, Adeline." "So could you," she said. "The ravine was 40 feet behind those cattle." He was quiet. "I did the arithmetic," she said, "same way I always do. I weighed the risk of going against the risk of not going, and I made a decision. That's all it was." "That's not all it was," he said, and his voice had gone to that low, flat register that meant he was feeling something he didn't quite have the words for yet. Ruth set a plate in front of each of them and then very deliberately moved to the far side of the kitchen to find something to do there. Adeline looked at her plate. Then at Gideon. His face was tired and there was a cut above his eyebrow from the fall she hadn't noticed before, and his color still wasn't right from the cold, and he was looking at her with an expression she'd been watching develop for months. Slowly, quietly, the way things develop out here, without announcement. "I found you," she said. "That was all. I found you, and you're here." He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not gripping, just there. His hand was still cold. Hers were too. She looked down at them and thought of all the things that had ever made her pull away from a hand reaching toward her and felt none of those things. She felt only the weight of it, solid and deliberate and asking nothing. "Thank you," he said quietly. She didn't say "you're welcome." It didn't fit. She turned her hand over under his so their palms were together, both cold, both warming, and she said, "Eat your supper before Ruth decides we're hopeless." On our side of the kitchen, Ruth said, without turning around, "I've already decided that." And something broke open in Adeline's chest that was, after everything, after all of it, just simply laughter. Real laughter, the kind that comes from a place that hasn't been reached in a long time, surprised out of her by the wrong moment and the right people. And she put her other hand over her mouth and felt it shake through her, helpless and warm. And across the table Gideon was laughing too, quietly, wincing when it moved his leg. And the storm outside was still throwing itself against the walls of the solid house, and finding them, as they had been all winter, as they would continue to be, holding. She had ridden into a blizzard and come back. She had done an impossible thing in bad conditions with shaking hands, and a horse that didn't want to cooperate, and a trail she could barely see, and she had brought him home. She had not done it because she was brave. She still wasn't sure she knew what brave meant, whether it was the absence of fear or just the decision to move in spite of it. She had done it because the arithmetic came out one way and she'd acted on it, the same as she always had. Only this time, what she was protecting was something she'd chosen and something that had chosen her back. That was the thing she sat with later, after Ruth had settled Gideon on the couch with his leg elevated and banked the fire for the night, and found herself a corner of the house to sleep in with the efficiency of a woman who had spent a lifetime making herself useful in other people's emergencies. Adeline sat in the kitchen in the quiet and listened to the storm diminishing outside, slower, the wind losing confidence, the snow falling now in the soft, almost apologetic way it fell after it had done its worst. She was not the same woman who had gotten on that train in Philadelphia. She was sure of that. The woman who had gotten on that train had been running, purely and simply, running from something specific and terrible with no clear picture of what she was running to. She'd had hope, maybe, the way you have hope when you're desperate enough that hope is the only option left, but it had been abstract, a direction more than a destination. She was not running now. She was sitting in her kitchen, the one where she'd burned cornbread and learned the fire and figured out the pump and made approximately 1,000 mistakes and kept going anyway. And she was choosing, for the first time in conscious memory, to stay somewhere, not because leaving was impossible, but because staying was what she wanted. The fear was still there. It would be there tomorrow, and probably for years. She'd worked that out over the winter, made a kind of peace with it. Or not peace exactly, more like a working arrangement. The fear was part of her. It had been built into her by years of things that shouldn't have happened to anyone, and it was not going to dismantle itself because she'd found a good man and a hard piece of land and learned how to fix a fence. But it was not the only thing she was. It had been, once. For a long time it had been nearly everything. Now it was one thing among others, and the others were gaining ground. She thought about the ravine, 40 feet, the cattle drifting toward it in the dark and the snow, and nobody there to turn them. She had turned them. She had stood in the middle of a blizzard 12 miles from anything and moved a herd of panicked cattle away from the edge with nothing but a rope and a voice and the memory of watching a man work them in fair weather. And then she had found her husband on the ground behind a boulder and gotten him onto a horse and brought him home. She had done that. It had not been clean or confident or impressive to watch. Her hands had shaken the whole time, and she'd said things to a horse that made no sense, and she'd gotten the knots wrong twice. She had done it anyway, and it had been enough. She blew out the lamp and sat for a moment in the dark, listening to the house settle around her, and she thought, I am not running from fear anymore. She wasn't sure yet what she was doing instead. Running toward something, maybe. Standing in front of something. The words weren't right yet, but the feeling was there, solid and new, like the frost-heaved ground in March when the thaw first starts. Uneven, a little treacherous, nothing you'd call solid. But underneath it, if you pressed your hand down, the earth beginning, slowly and with tremendous difficulty, to open. Spring came to the Colorado plains the way it always did out here. Not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week in March followed by 3 days of ice. Crocuses pushing through frost-cracked ground and then getting buried again under a late snow that nobody had warned them about. The land thawing and refreezing, the mud season arriving in earnest in April and turning every path into something that grabbed at your boots and held on. Gideon's leg healed crooked through February and then slowly uncrooked itself through March, which the doctor in town said was about what he expected, and which Gideon bore with the particular impatience of a man who considered stillness a personal failing. He wasn't good at being injured. He was polite about it, which was its own kind of difficult, because what he wanted to do was push himself, and what he did instead was stay at the table an extra hour in the evenings with maps and feed calculations and the ledger book, working through things with his head that he couldn't do yet with his body. Adeline took on the extra work without discussion. There was no conversation about it. It simply needed doing, and she did it. By March, she was handling the morning feeding alone and doing the fence checks 3 times a week, and had started taking a longer route on horseback to learn the sections of the property she didn't know as well yet. She was not doing it for him. She was doing it because the ranch was hers too, and that knowledge had settled into her over the winter in a way she hadn't fully anticipated. Not dramatically, not in a moment she could point to, just gradually, like the way a color soaks into cloth. Gideon noticed. He didn't remark on every specific thing she did, which she had come to understand was how he showed respect. By not making a performance of it, by treating her competence as a fact rather than a pleasant surprise. But one evening in late March, he looked up from the ledger and said, "We made it through the winter with 38 head, lost 2 in the storm, which is less than I expected." "The feed rationing helped," she said, "the way you set it up in November." "You followed it better than I did," he said. "I'd have given them more." She looked up from the shirt she was mending. "You're too soft on them." He almost smiled. It was more of a smile now than it had been in October. It made it further across his face before he pulled it back. which was its own kind of change, the kind you noticed only by comparison with how things had been. Maybe, he said. It was a small conversation. There had been a lot of small conversations over the winter, and she'd learned that they were the architecture of something larger, that the way you built a life with another person was mostly in the small conversations, the ones that weren't about anything important and were about everything at once. She knew she loved him by the time April came. She hadn't said it. She wasn't sure she trusted herself to say it yet. Not because the feeling wasn't real, but because she'd spent so long in a house where words were weapons, deployed and retracted and turned around to be used against you, that she still treated language with the caution of someone who'd been cut by it. The feeling was real. The words needed a little more time. He hadn't said it either. She thought he felt it. She was fairly good, after all these months, at reading the shape of what he didn't say. They were doing fine. They were, in fact, better than fine, which was the thing that made what happened in April so specifically jarring. The arrival of trouble in the middle of something that was working. Botsung. The first sign was a letter. It came on a Thursday, addressed to her in handwriting she recognized before she'd even read the name on the return address. Her stomach did something cold and immediate, a physical response that bypassed thought entirely and went straight to the body, the way it always had. She was standing at the post office counter in Mill Haven, and the postmaster, Mr. Denning, was waiting for her to take the letter with the incurious patience of a man who handled other people's mail all day and had long ago learned not to wonder about it. She took it. She put it in her coat pocket and walked out. She stood in the street outside for a full minute before she opened it. People passed. A wagon went by. She was aware of all of it in the abstract, peripheral way that you're aware of your surroundings when the thing in your hand has taken up all the room. The letter was short. That was somehow worse than if it had been long. Adeline, I know where you are. I will come and collect what is mine. You made a mistake leaving, and we both know it. CV, 4 sentences. No salutation, no question, just the flat certainty of a man who had never once in his life been told no and believed it would hold. She stood there in the April street and read it 3 times and felt, in order, the cold stomach thing, then rage, then something that wanted to be fear and that she watched, carefully, from the inside. Watching it the way you watch weather move across a plain, tracking where it was going and how fast. It was there. She didn't deny it. She also noted with a kind of careful precision that it was smaller than it would have been 6 months ago. Not gone. Not even close to gone. But smaller, and she was bigger, and the ratio had changed. She put the letter in her pocket and got on her horse and rode home. She told Gideon that evening. She set the letter on the table in front of him and sat down and watched him read it. His face went through something while he read. Not obvious. He wasn't an obvious man, but she could read him by now well enough to catch it. The stillness that arrived when he was controlling a reaction, the small movement in his jaw. He set it down. When did this come? Today, Thursday mail. He knows you're in Mill Haven specifically? He says he knows where I am, she said. That could mean the county. It could mean this specific road. I don't know. Gideon was quiet for a moment. We should tell the sheriff. Yes, she said. We should. She paused. But I want to be clear about something first. He waited. If he comes, she said, I'm not hiding. I'm not leaving. I'm not sending you out to handle it while I stay in the house. She looked at him steadily. He's mine to deal with. I understand if you want to be there. I'd want that. But I'm not standing behind you. Gideon held her gaze. I know that, he said. I'm not going to tell you to. I needed to say it out loud, she said. Not for you, for me. All right, he said. He folded the letter and slid it back across the table toward her, leaving it in her possession, which she understood was intentional. Then we go to the sheriff tomorrow, together, and we handle whatever comes. She picked up the letter. He used the word collect, she said, like I'm a debt. I read it, Gideon said, and his voice had a quality in it she hadn't heard before. Not anger exactly, something colder and more resolved than anger. He's going to be disappointed, she said. Yes, Gideon said. He is. Sheriff Cole Mabry was a large, unhurried man who had been law in Mill Haven County for 11 years, and who absorbed bad information with the composure of someone who had heard a great deal of it. He read the letter. He asked Adeline a series of questions that were direct and practical and contained no pity, which she appreciated. He asked about Cornelius Vance, his background, his resources, whether he had any legal claim over her, which she answered carefully. She had been his ward until 18, at which point the guardianship legally ended, and she had left at 23, a married woman, which meant he had no claim whatsoever under any law she knew of. Mabry listened and wrote things down. "He has no legal standing," he said. "If he shows up in my county causing trouble, I'll deal with him." He looked at her. "You want to know the truth, Mrs. Hart?" "Always," she said. "Men like this, and I've seen a few, they count on the woman being alone and scared. They count on it like a card in a hand." He tapped his pen on the desk. "They don't count on the woman having a year behind her and a county that knows her name." She thought about that on the ride home. A county that knows her name. It was more than she'd had 3 years ago. It was more than she'd had in October, when she'd stepped off a train with a carpet bag and the practiced blankness of someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible. Ruth Calloway knew her name. The Briggs family knew her name. The Dennings at the post office. The doctor who'd looked at Gideon's leg in February and nodded at her with the brief approval of someone who'd been told how the injury had been found and survived. Small things. A web of small things that added up to belonging somewhere. She hadn't set out to build that. It had grown around her while she was busy learning the pump and the fire and the fence. Cornelius Vance arrived on a Tuesday in late April. She knew he was in town before she saw him because Ruth sent word by way of Tom Briggs' eldest boy, a 9-year-old named Charlie, who arrived at their door on horseback at 7 in the morning, looking very important about his mission. That a man fitting the description she'd given Ruth was at the hotel asking about the Hart Ranch. Adeline read the note twice. Then she went to the kitchen and poured herself coffee and drank half of it standing at the window. Gideon came in from the barn and found her there and read the situation in her posture before she said anything. "He's in town," she said. He sat down. "All right." "I want to go in," she said. "Today. I don't want to wait for him to come here." "Why there instead of here?" "Because there is where people are," she said. "I don't want this to happen on private ground where it's just us and him. I want it in front of people." Gideon was quiet, thinking through it. She could see him considering, checking it from different angles. "You want witnesses," he said. "I want witnesses," she said. "I want every person in that town to see what he is and what I've become. I want there to be no version of this story where he gets to tell it his way to an empty room." He looked at her for a long moment. "I'll hitch the wagon," he said. She went to get her good coat. Not her best one, her working coat, the one that had been out in every kind of weather this territory had thrown at her, the one with the mended pocket and the sleeve she'd patched herself. She wasn't going to perform for Cornelius Vance. She was going to show up as exactly what she was. She did take the time to pin her hair properly. She owed herself that much. Millhaven on a Tuesday morning was a working town doing working things, wagons on the main street, the smithy already going, women at the dry goods store, men outside the feed merchant comparing weather opinions and the price of beef. Ordinary and grounded and solid. The kind of solid that had been built up over years by people who'd decided to stay. She spotted Cornelius before he spotted her. He was standing outside the hotel, and the first thing she noticed was that he looked older. Not old. He was only in his early 50s, but older than she carried him in memory, which was always a jarring thing when the monster you've been running from turns out to have aged while you were gone. He was dressed well, as he always had been, the kind of dressed well that was meant to establish a hierarchy the moment you looked at him. He was talking to a man she didn't recognize, and he had his hands in his jacket pockets and his chin at the particular angle he used when he was explaining something he considered obvious to someone he considered below him. He turned his head and saw her. For a moment, nothing moved. The town went on around them, a horse going past, 2 women talking outside the bakery, a boy running with something tucked under his arm. Normal morning sounds. She stood in the middle of the street next to her husband and looked at the man who had spent 14 years making her small, and she felt her heartbeat spike hard in her chest, once, and then settle. Not disappear, settle. He walked toward her. His expression had the controlled pleasantness of a man who was furious, and had decided to be charming about it, which was an expression she knew with her whole body. "Adeline," he said, his voice was the same. That was the worst part. After everything, the voice was exactly the same. "You're looking well." "Mr. Vance," she said. His eyes moved to Gideon. A quick assessment, the kind he did with everyone, measuring, categorizing, then back to her. "I'd like to speak with you privately." "No," she said. A small pause. He wasn't used to that word from her. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no. Anything you have to say to me, you can say here." His pleasantness thinned at the edges. "Adeline, there are matters that concern our family that I don't think need to be aired. We're not family," she said. The words came out even. She was a little surprised by that, by how even they were. "You were my guardian until I was 18. That ended. I'm 24 years old and I've been married for 6 months and I live here. There's nothing to discuss." "You left without a word," he said. "That kind of ingratitude. Don't." She said it quietly, but something in the way she said it stopped him. "Don't talk to me about ingratitude." People were watching. She was aware of it in her peripheral vision. The women outside the bakery had gone still. A man leaning against the feed merchant's wall was watching with undisguised attention. She had wanted witnesses. She had them. "I think," Cornelius said, shifting his weight slightly, changing tactics the way he always did when the first approach didn't work. She knew this playbook. She'd been watching it for years. "That you may have said some things to people here that misrepresent the situation. I'd like the opportunity to—" "I showed my husband my arms," she said. "On the second night I was here. I didn't misrepresent anything." His face changed. The pleasantness dropped entirely for one unguarded second, and underneath it was the thing she'd always known was there. The cold, offended fury of a man who believed that what happened inside his house belonged to him, and that she had violated something by existing outside it. "That is a private—" "Not anymore," she said. Gideon, beside her, hadn't moved or spoken. She felt his presence the way you feel solid ground, not as something you're looking at, but as something you're standing on. He was not intervening. He was not stepping forward. He was simply there, which was exactly what she'd asked for and exactly what she needed. Ruth materialized from somewhere to Adeline's left. She didn't know when Ruth had arrived or where she'd come from, but Ruth was there now, arms folded, with the particular expression of a woman who had heard enough and had made herself available. Tom Briggs was across the street. She hadn't seen him come either. Sheriff Mabry was standing outside his office, 2 buildings down, not approaching, just present, watching, which was its own message. Cornelius looked around at them. She saw him read the situation, the woman he'd driven across the country to collect, standing in the middle of a street she knew with people who knew her, and not one of those people looking at him with anything that resembled deference. "You always were dramatic," he said, and there was venom in it now, the pleasantness entirely gone. "I was quiet," she said. "There's a difference. I was quiet because I was afraid, and because being afraid was the reasonable response to living with you." She was aware that her voice was carrying. She was aware of that, and she let it. "I was 9 years old when you became my guardian, and I was 23 when I left. And in those 14 years, you put your hands on me more times than I can count, and you told me it was my fault, and I believed you for longer than I should have. And I am standing here in front of every person in this town telling you that I know better now." The street was very quiet. "I don't have a single thing that belongs to you," she continued. "I don't owe you an explanation or an apology or a private conversation. I don't owe you anything. And if you come to this county again, Sheriff Mabry will have something to say about it." She paused. "Are we finished?" Cornelius Vance stood in the middle of Millhaven's Main Street, and she watched him make the calculation she'd seen him make 100 times, weigh the cost, measure the resistance, decide whether the fight was worth the effort. Only this time, the resistance wasn't a frightened girl in a house he controlled. This time, it was a woman standing in a place she belonged, surrounded by people who would remember what they'd seen, under the eye of a lawman who'd already written down his name. She watched him decide. It didn't happen all at once. His chin dropped a fraction. His shoulders, still square, he had too much pride to let them fall, adjusted slightly. His eyes moved around the scene one more time and came back to her with the look of a man who is retreating and hates every step of it. "You've made your choice," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have, quite a while ago." He looked at Gideon. Whatever he saw there apparently added nothing useful to his position. He looked back at her and he said nothing else. And then he turned and walked back toward the hotel with the careful posture of a man trying to preserve his dignity. Nobody said anything while he was still visible. Then Ruth exhaled loudly beside her and said, "Well," in the tone of someone closing a book. Adeline's legs were shaking. She'd known they would shake once it was over, the body claiming what she'd owed it during the part where she'd needed to hold everything still, and she shifted her weight and breathed and let them shake a little. Gideon put his hand on her back, flat, steady, between her shoulder blades, not holding her up, just there. "You all right?" he said, low, for her alone. "Yes," she said. "My legs are doing a thing." "I noticed," he said. "You hit it well." "Practice," she said. He made a small sound that was not quite a laugh but was close, and she felt it against her side because he was close enough for that. Mabry crossed the street toward them. He looked at Adeline with the even, assessing look he'd had in his office. "He'll leave," he said. "Men like that, they don't handle an audience. He'll leave today. But I'll watch the hotel, and I'll watch the road." He paused. "What you did there, standing out in the open, saying it where people could hear, that was smart." "I had a lot of time to think about how I didn't want to handle it," she said. He nodded once and went back to his office. Ruth squeezed her arm and said something about pie. There was always pie with Ruth, pie as punctuation, pie as the thing you did after something hard. And Adeline said maybe later and meant it. They stood in the street a little while longer, the two of them, and the town went back to being a town around them. The sounds coming back, the movement, the ordinary Tuesday of it all, resuming as if nothing had happened, which in a way was the best possible outcome. What had happened was done. It didn't need to be more than what it was. He did leave that afternoon. Tom Briggs confirmed it, having watched the hotel with the dedication of a man who had been told to watch something and was going to watch it thoroughly. The stage south. Cornelius Vance, 2 bags, the face of a man who had lost a contest and was busy revising the story of it in his own head. She was in the kitchen making supper when Tom came to tell them, and she nodded and kept chopping and said, "Thank you, Tom." When Tom left, she stood at the counter for a moment with the knife in her hand and thought about nothing in particular, just existing in the kitchen, just being in the room that was hers, in the house that was hers, on the land that was hers. The fear was still there in the residue the day had left behind. A tiredness that went deeper than physical, the particular exhaustion of having held yourself together through something that mattered. She felt it and let it be there and kept chopping. Gideon came in from the barn at the usual time, washed his hands at the usual basin, sat at the table in the usual chair, all the usual things. She set supper down between them and sat across from him. "It's done," she said. "Yes," he said. "I keep waiting for something else to feel," she said. "Some big feeling, relief, or—" She made a gesture with her fork. "Something larger." "Maybe it comes later," he said. "Or maybe this is it," she said. "Maybe this is what it feels like. Just, it's done, and you're still standing, and the stew is on the table." He considered that seriously, the way he considered things. "That might be exactly what it feels like," he said. She ate supper. It was not perfect supper. The potatoes were slightly overcooked, and she'd added too much pepper. And it was their kitchen and their table, and the April evening was coming through the window in that long golden way it had out here, taking its time the way the light always did on the plains. And across from her was a man who had never once told her that what she felt was wrong, or what she remembered was exaggerated, or what she'd survived wasn't real. She thought about the letter sitting in her coat pocket all day, that flat, cold certainty. "I will come and collect what is mine." She thought about standing in the street with her legs shaking and her voice carrying, and 14 years of fear making itself useful for the first time by teaching her exactly how to stand very still and look very certain when she needed to. She had not won anything glamorous. There was no clean resolution to the fact of those 14 years, no amount of public truth-telling that gave them back or made them right. She knew that. Some things stayed crooked, like a shoulder that had healed wrong. You didn't fix them. You learned their limits, and you went on. But she had stood in a street in the place she lived, and she had said what was true in front of people who were willing to hear it. And the man who had made himself enormous in her life for 24 years had walked to a stage and gotten on it and left, and she was still here. She was still here, and the potatoes were overcooked, and the light was doing that thing over the plains, and Gideon passed her the bread without being asked, because he'd noticed she always took bread, and she tore off a piece and ate it and thought, "This is what I stayed for." Not the moment in the street, not the confrontation or the witnesses or the moral victory of it. She had stayed for the kitchen table and the bread, and the man across from her who treated her competence as a fact, and the land outside that was big enough to take up more room than her fear, and the life she was building out of all of it one ordinary day at a time, imperfect and hers and ongoing. The evening light moved across the table between them, gold going slowly amber, and outside the April wind came in off the mountains, lighter now than it had been all winter, carrying something in it that was almost warmth. Almost. Getting there. The summer after Cornelius Vance left Millhaven on that southbound stage was the quietest summer Adeline could remember. Not quiet in the way her life in Philadelphia had been quiet. That had been the quiet of held breath, of a house where noise meant danger and silence was something you maintained the way you maintained a wound, carefully, because disturbing it made things worse. This was different. This was the quiet of a life that had stopped bracing itself. She noticed it first in small ways. She stopped cataloging exits when she walked into a room. Not all at once, it was gradual, like losing a habit you didn't know you had until one day you realize you haven't done it in a while. She'd walk into the dry goods store in Millhaven, and she'd just walk in, and it would be several minutes before she noticed she hadn't scanned the corners, hadn't checked who was between her and the door. She'd notice, and she'd stand there for a moment thinking, that's new. And it would feel strange, and then it would feel like something she was allowed to have. She still had bad nights. She expected she always would. Some memories don't fade so much as lose their frequency. They come less often, hit a little softer, and you develop a better relationship with the morning after. Gideon had learned, without her telling him, to simply be in the kitchen when she came down from those nights. Not talking, not asking, just there with the coffee already on, doing some small thing with his hands, filling the space with ordinary presence until the night lost its hold. She had told him once that she appreciated it. He had said, without looking up from whatever he was mending, that he'd had bad nights of his own in the early years out here, and somebody making coffee had helped. She hadn't pushed on what his early years had contained. He hadn't pushed on hers. They had simply extended each other that courtesy and gone on, which was, she had come to believe, one of the more genuine forms of love available to people who had both been damaged by life and were trying to live it anyway. She told him she loved him on a Wednesday evening in June. It was not a significant Wednesday. She had come in from checking the east pasture, boots muddy, one sleeve damp from where she'd gotten it into the water trough trying to clear the blockage on the float valve, and she'd found him at the table reading something with his glasses on. She hadn't known he had glasses until March, when he'd quietly started wearing them in the evenings, apparently having decided she knew him well enough now to see that. And she'd looked at him, and the feeling was simply there, plain and complete, and she said it before she'd decided to. "I love you," she said. "I thought you should know." He looked up from the paper. He looked at her for a moment with the glasses still on and the particular expression he had when something mattered to him and he was working out how to hold it properly. "I love you too," he said. "I've been trying to figure out when to say it." "Wednesday evening works," she said. "Apparently," he said. She went to wash her hands and didn't make anything more of it, and neither did he. And it sat between them for the rest of the evening like a thing that had always been there and had just now been given its right name. The first woman came in August. Her name was Clara Hennessy, and she arrived at the ranch on foot, which was the first alarming thing because the nearest neighbor was 4 miles away. And it was mid-morning on a hot day, and she was carrying a child on her hip and a bundle under her other arm, and her face had a quality to it that Adeline recognized without needing to be told what it meant. Adeline was in the yard when she saw her coming up the road. She went to meet her halfway. Clara was 27, she said, though she looked older than that, the way some people do when the years have been working harder than the calendar. The child was 18 months and had its mother's watchful eyes. Claire had come from a homestead 12 miles north. Her husband had been gone for 2 days on what he'd told her was a supply run, which they both understood meant something else, and she had $3 to her name and nowhere specific to go except away from where she'd been. She said all of this in a flat, practical voice, the kind of voice you use when you've used up the energy for emotion and what's left is just information. Adeline listened to all of it. Then she said, "Come inside. We'll start with food and then figure out the rest. They sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Adeline had first drunk coffee across from Gideon, the same table where she'd found his note before riding into the blizzard, where they'd eaten supper the evening Cornelius left. And Clara ate with the careful restraint of someone who was hungry but trying not to look it, and the child ate without any such restraint, and Adeline put more food on the plate without comment. Gideon came in at noon and found them there and read the situation in one pass of his eyes and said, "There's room in the back." That was all he said. Clara looked at him with the wariness that was second nature to women who had learned that men who seemed fine often weren't, and he apparently understood the look because he nodded once and went back out, giving her time and space to decide what she thought. "He's all right," Adeline said. Clara looked at her. "How do you know? About a person?" "You don't," Adeline said. Not all at once. You watch what they do with small things. Over time, small things are harder to fake." She paused. "But you trust your own read first. Your read has kept you alive this long." Clara was quiet for a moment. "Your read ever been wrong?" "Yes," Adeline said. "Not about him, but about other things. Being wrong is part of it. You get better." Clara stayed 4 days. Ruth Calloway came over on the second day with information about a situation 2 towns east. A widow woman who took in boarders and was known for being reliable, a minister's wife who helped women in exactly this kind of circumstance get set up with work, a lawyer who had handled 2 similar situations in the last year and charged what people could pay rather than what he wanted. Ruth produced this information with the efficiency of someone who had been quietly compiling it for a long time and was glad to finally use it. Adeline helped Clara write a letter. Then she helped her compose what to say when she arrived. Not a script, but the bones of it, the parts that mattered and needed to be said in the right order so the right people would understand quickly. She had some experience by now with the bones of a difficult thing. The morning Clara left in the Calloway's wagon, she stopped at the door and looked at Adeline and said, "I didn't know where else to go. I just started walking." "That's enough," Adeline said. "Starting is enough." She watched the wagon out of sight down the road and stood in the yard for a while after it was gone. She wasn't sure what she was feeling exactly, something that had both weight and lightness to it at once, which was a contradiction that seemed to be accurate anyway. She had been Clara, in the essential way. Not identically, lives were never identical, but in the core of it, the having nowhere to go except away, the walking towards something that was mostly just a direction. She had been that woman. She was not that woman now. She had become something else, and part of something else was being useful to the woman she used to be. There were 3 more women before the year was out. Word traveled the way word traveled out here. Not through newspapers or official channels, but through the network of women that Ruth had described back in those first weeks. Women out here look out for each other. That's not optional. It turned out that network was larger and more deliberate than Adeline had initially understood. A loose web of information and resource and quiet coordination that had been operating long before she arrived and would operate long after, and she had become a part of it without quite deciding to. She and Ruth sat down in October and talked through what they were actually doing and whether they should be more intentional about it. Ruth had been doing pieces of this work for years, she said, pointing women toward resources, making introductions, lending a room when needed. But it had been informal, reactive, dependent on whoever happened to be present when someone needed help. "It would be better," Ruth said, "if it was a thing instead of a not thing." "A thing," Adeline said. "An organized thing, not formal. Formal means papers and men deciding who qualifies. Just a known point, a place people know they can come to." They talked about what that could look like, practically, on a working ranch with limited room and resources, and 2 people who already had full days. They talked about what Ruth's farm could offer, and what the Calloway connections in the next county could offer, and who else in the area was already doing pieces of this without naming it. They talked for 3 hours and drank too much coffee, and the ideas got more specific as they went, which was the sign, in Adeline's experience, that something was real rather than theoretical. Gideon, when she told him, said, "What do you need from me?" Not "are you sure?" or "is that practical?" or "that's a lot to take on." Just, "What do you need?" "I don't know yet," she said. "I'll tell you when I do." "All right," he said. She told him 2 weeks later she needed the back room made more consistently usable, which meant a real bed rather than the spare mattress. and she needed to know whether the finances could absorb periodic unplanned guests. He looked at the ledger with her for an hour, and they worked through what was possible and what wasn't. And what wasn't possible right now was more possible than she'd expected, which was the thing about this ranch. It was not wealthy, but it was managed, carefully, by two people who both paid attention, and careful management over a year had made more room than the raw numbers would have suggested. They put in a real bed. It was a modest one, bought from the carpenter in Mill Haven, who did honest work for honest price, and Adeline put her mother's extra quilt on it, the one she'd brought in the carpet bag, kept folded in the chest all year, and stood back and looked at the room and thought, my mother would have liked this. Her mother had been dead since she was 8. She didn't think about her constantly, but she thought about her sometimes in moments like this, when she was building something her mother hadn't had the chance to build. The second year on the ranch was harder in some ways and better in most others, which was, Ruth told her, exactly the pattern. First year you're surviving, Ruth said. Second year you're learning what you're actually doing. Third year you start to have opinions about it. I had opinions in the first year, Adeline said. Useful ones? She considered. Some. The herd grew. Not dramatically. Gideon was not a man who overextended, who borrowed against future optimism, but steadily, in the deliberate way he did most things. He brought in 12 new head in the spring and a good bull in June that Tom Briggs said was the best decision Gideon had made in 5 years, which Gideon received without visible satisfaction, but which Adeline could tell pleased him, because he went and checked on the bull 3 more times that day than was strictly necessary. She had taken over the books entirely by the second year. It had happened gradually, without a formal conversation. She had a head for numbers, had always had a head for numbers in the way you develop skills in areas where they help you survive. And Cornelius's household accounts had been something she'd managed informally for years without credit. She understood ledgers. She understood where money came from and where it went, and the difference between cutting something that hurt now and cutting something that would hurt later. Gideon was better at the physical knowing of the land, which pasture needed resting, which fence section was going to go before the next winter, the exact condition of each animal in a way that was almost intuitive. Together they made decisions that neither of them would have made as well alone. She told him that once. He said, I know. Then after a pause, I'm better at it than I was. At what? Deciding things with someone else. He didn't elaborate. She didn't push. She understood that there was history there, his own, the early years he'd mentioned in pieces. A wife before, she'd gathered, though he'd never said it directly, and she hadn't asked, and it was his to tell or not to tell, in the same way hers had been. Me too, she said. Better than I was. That was the sum of that conversation, and it was enough. The letter from Clara came in the spring of the second year. 2 pages, careful handwriting, from the town 2 counties east. She had work at the dry goods store. The child was doing well. She had filed the legal papers with the help of the lawyer Ruth had recommended, and the matter was settled. She had a room of her own that locked from the inside, which she wanted Adeline to know because she understood that Adeline would understand why that detail mattered. I think about what you said, Clara wrote near the end, about starting being enough. I told another woman that last month. Someone at the store. I don't know if it helped, but I said it. Adeline read the letter twice and then set it on the table and went outside and stood in the May morning and looked at the plains and felt the things she'd felt the morning Clara left. The weight and lightness together. The contradiction that was somehow accurate. She was 30 years old. She had been married nearly 4 years. The woman who had walked out of a Philadelphia house with a carpet bag and a hidden letter felt like someone she remembered clearly but had also become genuinely difficult to inhabit. The way you can remember being afraid of something you no longer fear. You can describe the fear precisely, but you can't quite feel it from the inside anymore. She had not become fearless. She had become something more useful than fearless. She had become someone who understood her own fear well enough to work around it, to use it when it gave her information and set it aside when it was only noise, to live fully in the days when it was quiet and to get through the days when it wasn't. That was not a cure. It was something better than a cure. It was a working life, which was all any actual person had. It was Ruth who put it into words. On a fall afternoon in the 3rd year, sitting on the Hart's porch with coffee going cold in both their cups, because they'd been talking through the cold and neither had noticed. They'd been discussing a woman named Josephine who had arrived the week before, younger than the others, 19, with no child but a very specific kind of hunted look that both of them recognized, and what the next practical steps were. And the conversation had wandered, the way conversations wandered when you'd been having versions of it long enough that the edges went soft. "You know what you've built here," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "A ranch," Adeline said. "Besides that." Adeline looked out at the yard, the barn, the fence lines running toward the horizon. She'd learned to read like a sentence. The back room with the bed and her mother's quilt. The kitchen where the fire behaved itself now, where she'd burned the first cornbread and had stood there furious and kept going anyway. "A place," she said. "A place that knows what it's for," Ruth said. "That's rarer than a building." Adeline thought about that. About 9-year-old Adeline arriving in Cornelius Vance's house, which had also been a building that knew what it was for, just for the wrong things, for the diminishment of whoever lived inside it. She thought about the train and the advertisement she'd read on a Philadelphia sidewalk in 6 unguarded minutes, and the man at the end of the platform turning his hat in his hands because he was nervous too. She thought about the fence she'd repaired wrong and then right, and the steer in the dark and the blizzard and the ravine, and standing in a street saying true things out loud until a man got on a stage and left. She thought about Wednesday evening in June, muddy boots, wet sleeve, the kitchen table, the words that had come out before she'd decided to say them. "I almost didn't come," she said. "I almost didn't send the letter." Ruth looked at her. "What stopped you from not sending it?" "I ran out of other options," she said. "That's the honest answer. I was down to one door and I opened it." "Most people don't open the last door," Ruth said. "They stand in front of it." Adeline was quiet for a moment. "I was more afraid of staying than of going," she said. "That's the only reason." "That's a real reason," Ruth said. "That's as real as it gets." The afternoon light was doing its October thing, going gold early, the shadows of the fence post stretching long across the yard. Somewhere in the barn, one of the horses shifted and stamped. Gideon was out in the far pasture with Tom and would be back by supper, and she knew that the way she knew the layout of the land now, not by thinking about it, just by knowing it, the way you know the shape of the place you live. She had not fixed herself. She wanted to be clear about that, even in her own thinking, because the story you told about your own life mattered, and she'd heard too many stories that implied a clean before and after, a broken thing, and then a mended thing, as if people were objects that could be returned to their original state. She was not her original state. She was something she'd become through years of being damaged and then years of doing different work. And the seams showed, and they always would, and she had largely made her peace with that. What she had was a life she had built with her own hands on ground she had chosen. What she had was a man who read her competence as a given, and her bad nights as a shared problem, and her opinions as worth hearing. What she had was a room with a bed and a quilt, where women who were still on the wrong side of their last door could come and catch their breath. What she had was the knowledge, earned and specific and not abstract, that fear could be survived, that the body was tougher than it appeared, that starting was enough. She wasn't going to pretend that was everything. There were still days when the weight of those 14 years pressed down hard, and she moved through the morning slowly and had to remind herself, practically and without sentiment, that the person who had made those years what they were no longer had any access to her. There were still nights. There would probably always be nights. But there were also mornings when she stood in her kitchen with the fire drawing properly and the coffee on and the light coming in off the plains, and she felt, not happiness exactly, happiness was too light a word, too simple. She felt the solid, specific satisfaction of someone living the life they chose rather than the life that was handed to them. That was not nothing. That was, in her considered view, quite a lot. When Gideon came in that evening, he smelled like the outdoors and horses and October, and he washed his hands at the basin and sat at the table and said, "How'd it go with Josephine today?" "She's going to be all right," Adeline said. "She doesn't know it yet." He accepted that. "Ruth still out on the porch when I came in?" "She left an hour ago. She has her own supper to make." "She stays later every time," he said without complaint. "We talk a lot," Adeline said. He poured himself coffee and looked at her across the rim of his cup, with that look she knew by now, the one that meant he was seeing her clearly and finding the view worth having. It was a look that had taken her a long time to trust, not because she doubted him, but because she'd had to learn that being seen clearly was not the same as being exposed, that someone could know the whole shape of you and still think the view was worth having. That was a lesson she'd had to learn slowly, and she didn't begrudge the time it took. "You're thinking," he said. "I'm usually thinking," she said. "Specific thoughts or general ones?" She considered. "About doors," she said. "And which ones you open and which ones you don't." He turned that over. "And?" "And that I'm glad I opened the right one," she said. He set his cup down and didn't say anything immediately, in the way he had when something landed and he was letting it settle. Then he said, "Me too, for what it's worth." "It's worth a lot," she said. Supper was nothing special. Bread she'd made that morning, a pot of beans that had been going since afternoon, salt pork she'd put in for flavor. The meal of a working ranch on an ordinary fall evening, nothing that would impress anyone, everything that was needed. They ate it at the table where they had been eating together for 3 years now, and the conversation moved between the practical and the quiet, and back again, the way it always did. The way she had come to understand was the texture of a life shared rather than a life performed. Josephine came down from the back room and ate with them, still careful, still watchful, still on the early side of learning to trust a table. Adeline watched her without watching her, peripheral, easy, the way you kept an eye on something fragile without making it feel fragile. She remembered that feeling, the being watched that felt like pressure, the being watched that felt like care. She tried to make hers the second kind. After supper, Josephine said quietly, to no one in particular, "It's nice here." "It's a working ranch," Adeline said. "It's not nice all the time." "No," Josephine said. "I know, I just meant, it's nice right now." Adeline looked at the table, the plates, the lamp burning in the middle of it, Gideon with his second cup of coffee, the window with the dark October night outside, and the barn showing a faint light where Tom had left the lamp burning when he checked the horses before he went home. "Yes," she said. "It is." Later, after Josephine had gone back up, and the table was cleared and the fire banked and the house settling into its nighttime sounds, the sounds she knew now, the wood contracting, not footsteps, never footsteps. She stood at the back door and looked out at the plains under the dark sky. 3 years ago, she had been standing at the bottom of a set of stairs in a house in Philadelphia, listening to footsteps and making herself breathe. She had been counting the distance between herself and a door. She had been surviving, which was not the same as living, and she had known the difference even then, which was the cruelest part of surviving. You understood what you were missing while you were too busy staying alive to reach for it. She had reached for it. One letter written in pieces on stolen paper in 6-minute windows of privacy. One desperate calculation that anything was better than this. One step toward the last door when all the other doors had closed. She was standing in the home she had made and the life she had built, and the fear was still in her. Smaller, quieter. A companion she had not chosen and could not evict, but had learned to live alongside rather than underneath. And beside her was a man she loved, who loved her back in the plain and daily ways that turned out to matter most. And in the room behind her was a woman who was still on the wrong side of her own last door. And in the morning, Adeline would sit across from her at this table and tell her what she knew, which was not that it got easy, but that it got different, and different was enough to move toward. The plains went on forever under the stars, wide and dark and indifferent to human trouble, in the way that had frightened her when she first arrived and now simply felt honest. The land didn't care what you'd been through. It only cared what you did next. It only asked, can you work? Can you stay? Can you keep going when the work is hard and the winter is long and nothing is guaranteed? She could. She had. She would. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything.